In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
And speaking of excellence, I wanted to just start tonight with my all-time favorite, the guy who made me want to be a journalist when I was a kid, David Brinkley. It's been 20 years now since David Brinkley passed away. He died in 2003 at the age of 82. But what a life this guy lived. He had a journalism career that spanned more than 60 years, evolving alongside technology. He started out as a newspaper man at a small hometown newspaper in North Carolina, moved on to network radio for NBC Radio, and he covered Franklin Delano Roosevelt's White House and was also White House correspondent for Harry Truman's administration. And then along comes television in the late 40s, and David was one of the first to use that new medium for a nightly newscast. Kind of pioneered what that was, what we now call the NBC Nightly News. He started that in the late 40s, and of course later the Huntley-Brinkley Report was the top-rated evening news program for over a decade. I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember Huntley and Brinkley, but they showed us how it's done. And then, of course, he went on to ABC and did This Week with David Brinkley for another 16 years. So he spent 38 years at NBC between radio and television. And then he went to ABC and stayed there until the end of his life. But I wanted to show you a little bit of a Brinkley flashback. This is when he left. You're probably old enough to remember this one, Rick. He left NBC in 1981. And you remember good old John Chancellor, of course, or Chancellor. Yep. It was never John Chancellor. It was John Chancellor. That's how he always said it.
David Brinkley decided recently to bring to an end his career at NBC News, which spans 38 years, and go on to other work. His appearance tonight on the NBC magazine with David Brinkley will be his final one at NBC. He began in television in the old days of fuzzy black and white pictures on little screens. Since then, he's done it all. As a writer, he is simply the best. As a stylist, he's impossible to imitate, although a lot of people have tried. Many memories around here tonight.
Today's news today. In Washington, politics is always a major industry, but lately it's been more so.
And be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours.
Today, we had a cameraman at the White House spend the whole day making pictures of Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower. First, she greets 8 members of the Senior Girl Scout Troop 25 of Ridgewood, New Jersey. A little later in the day, 10 minutes later, here came the winner of the National Cherry Pie Baking Contest. Well, we are off to a flying start in many ways, Chet. I was a little staggered to see this convention start on time, and so were the delegates because they weren't here.
We were here in our not very commodious but most comfortable glassed-in booth. It used to be that Eastern money largely financed the Republican Party. Now, Chet, I believe you were telling me the other day about some Wall Street bankers.
First of all, I don't know too many Wall Street brokers and bankers.
Well, I might say you impressed me when you were telling it. I was led to believe you're widely acquainted in those circles.
We do know that wherever our reporters go on the floor, they are followed by unidentified, faceless men who attempt to listen to everything they say.
Political parties have more dignitaries per square foot than any other kind of institution in America.
Kansas City has done a good job setting up for its first political convention since 1928. It has even emptied a barn, normally filled with sheep, run air conditioning into it, and made offices in it for Republicans.
Apparently they think anybody who wears a Brooks Brothers suit and does not know how to tie a tie is a liberal.
He doesn't know how to tie a tie?
No, they're always crooked.
A medical researcher has surveyed 1,000 narcotics addicts and found that only 8 of them were Republicans and 999 were Democrats. And if a campaigning politician could not make promises, he could hardly open his mouth. Out of curiosity, on the mall one spring day, we asked some visitors if they would sell us the film out of their cameras. It appears from the home movies that Washington shakes and trembles quite a lot, is sometimes out of focus. All these piles represent a part, just a part, of the paper flooding into the office of one member of Congress, one member, in a few months. Vienna is so much in love with its past, it refuses to leave it. The Viennese in the past didn't believe in too much work, and they still don't. In this town, if you don't move fast, you'll be run over by a swarm of chattering Chinese. This is a picture of a man going out to lunch. Egypt, the Sahara Desert, south of Cairo.
And David, thanks for these years of happy association and for being such an easy colleague to work with and for all the kindnesses.
Good night, Chet. And from Washington, thank you and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC News.
Good night, Chet. Good night, David.
Sounded very futuristically digital.
Yeah, the news music back then, which hurt your ears. But this past month, I started rereading David Brinkley's book. I don't know if you've ever read this. Great book. It's his autobiography. Highly recommend it. Very amusing. I mean, nobody could write like David. He had such a command of the language. He was very, almost poetic. He could make the news like poetry, and always that great wit, that great sense of humor. But what a lot of people don't know, because he never talked about it, it wasn't done back then. Newscasters just didn't talk about their private lives. It just wasn't the way it was, to quote Walter Cronkite. But David Brinkley, finally, after he retired in 1995, wrote this book. And his life story is really, really something. And there's no way to cover it. We could spend the whole 2 hours just talking about David Brinkley, but I'll give you kind of a brief biography of his life. He was born in 1943 in rural North Carolina. And did I say 43? I'm sorry. He was born in 1921. But in 1943, that's when he started his career. And this was during the Second World War. And like most young men, he had joined the Army. But the Army kicked him out. They gave him an honorable medical discharge for a medical condition that it turns out he didn't even have. But it disqualified him from service, which was kind of a lucky break. It was a very lucky break. As it turns out, his entire unit was wiped out on the beaches of Normandy a year later, after D-Day. It was a 250-man unit. 245 were lost, and he most likely would have been killed, and we never would have had a David Brinkley. So he gets kicked out of the Army in 1943, and he's already got that bug. We have it when we're young and we know what we want to do, and he wanted to be a journalist. So he talked to CBS News. He was working at a little radio station, and he asked his news director to call up CBS News in Washington, and tried to talk him into offering him a job in the Washington Bureau, because there's a world war on, and he knows it's the biggest story, and He's just itching to go cover it, right? So apparently they did have a job for him, or so he was told. And he took the first train to D.C. and went to Bill White at CBS. And Mr. White refused to see him, sent word that he'd never heard of me and had no job to offer, he writes. What happened? I never knew, David Brinkley said. I asked the receptionist to take a message back to Mr. White for me. Go to hell, he said. He walked 4 blocks over to NBC News at 14th and New York Streets, was hired in 10 minutes, and worked there for the next 38 years. So take that, CBS. And as you recall, CBS and NBC, they were always the 2 big networks duking it out for ratings supremacy and number 1. And back in the 60s, it was this big competition between Walter Cronkite and the CBS Evening News and the NBC Huntley-Brinkley report. They were always, fierce competitors. So it literally started that way too. But his first assignment, get this, he's barely 21 or 22, got his first assignment covering the White House, right? Because most of his peers were over at war in Europe. So there was an opening. He was just a kid. He took it. And there he is doing weekly press conferences in the Oval Office with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he described what those were like. No president's done press conferences like that since Roosevelt was crippled. He was in a wheelchair. It was just easier to bring the reporters into the Oval Office so he didn't have to get up or move. And they would gather around his desk, and he would, do the news conference. And every week, no spokesperson. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the questions himself. It was very informal. And the thing that Brinkley remembers is everybody was smoking up a storm. Everybody smoked back then. And you could smoke in the White House. FDR's there smoking. He's got his Camel. He loved his Camel cigarettes, and the long cigarette holder. And the place was just choking with smoke, but everybody was a smoker back then. In fact, you could smoke in the White House until 1993. Hillary Clinton changed that. When the Clintons came into the White House, like his first day in office, Hillary made Bill put out an executive order saying that all federal buildings from now on are going to be smoke-free, which was funny because he was a smoker. He smoked big old cigars. But, back then, before the Huntley-Brinkley report, and this was true of all networks, David writes about this in his book. Up until the late 1960s, most of the TV and radio newscasts were sponsored by tobacco companies. NBC famously had the Camel News Caravan, sponsored by Camel, in which the anchors and the reporters, everybody smoked like chimneys live on the air, including David Brinkley. The makers of Camel bring the world's latest news events right into your living room. So sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. It's the Camel News Caravan presenting today's news, produced for Camel Cigarettes by NBC.
Today's news today.
Imagine that.
Which actually made sense back then because it was that was difficult.
A big deal.
It was difficult to get the information on the air the same day. You were shooting film. It had to be processed. It had to be edited, turned into something. It's not like today. It's not instant. Now it went from, if you think back, the first news wire, the first wire across the Atlantic, right? That changed the nature of news as well. Otherwise, before then, you had to, there were no telephones. You'd have to wait for
It'd be a week.
Yeah. On a ship or something, right? Write it on a piece of paper and
telegram.
Telegram, whatever, right? But across the Atlantic, until you had the wire, there was no communication.
That's right. Most big stories, you had to wait until the morning paper, the next day's paper, to find out what happened.
So the technology changes the way news is covered, It changes the way the public perceives it, the way you receive it. Your perspective changes. There's less information density. So you have, the first news wire that's basically set up with a cable that goes from Europe to North America under the ocean. Then you progress, into film cameras, newsreels in movie theaters. So people would go to the theaters to get some of their news. You've got those old Pathé newsreels. Those would run before movies, right?
Right.
So that's
Only
the way
once
people,
a week. You might
Yeah.
get a new one once every week.
Yeah.
That would be the news of the week.
So if you think about that changes, that affects people's minds, right?
right.
Now we have a device that's with us constantly, and we're being bombarded with information, visual information, audio, constantly. Very high tech, very sophisticated information programs, right? And I think back to, sorry, go ahead.
Instant. Breaking news in an instant, live as it happens.
That's
all
right.
over the world.
When I got into television, I carried around, they said, you can be a one-man band. Oh, that's great. 50-pound camera with like a tube camera they gave me with a side recorder, U-matic 3/4-inch videotape. The tapes were like this big, right?
Yes.
Just the tape.
That's right.
So I'm carrying around probably over 100 pounds just in camera gear, plus a tripod, plus a great big light and a giant battery belt, right? And the camera guys back then, including me, would blow out their shoulders and their backs all the time.
And that's the reason why they only hired men for that job. That's the number one reason that women, it was hard enough for women to get a job in the media back then anyway, but
That's true.
They, if they wouldn't send us on location because of the equipment. It was just too much for a little lady to handle.
I could tell you stories about the equipment.
I bet your back can tell stories to this day.
The shoulder right here, I ended up with frozen shoulder for an
Yeah.
extended period of time because of all of that.
That is no joke.
Yeah.
That is no joke. In fact, I want to show you some of what these cameras and what the equipment looked like back then, because I bet when you entered the business, Rick, in the 80s or early 90s, some of this equipment was still in use.
Yep.
Wouldn't surprise me. I know when I came in the 80s, they were still using cameras from the 1950s and 60s, because that stuff was built to last, boy, and they would use it for 30 more years.
Activities in Los Angeles
Here's the
will continue after
1960
this
Democratic
pause for
National
station
Convention
identification.
coverage.
Huntley
NBC
Brinkley
News.
for the most comprehensive Democratic
John F.
Convention
Kennedy
coverage
was
starting
going
Monday.
to sweep that convention that year.
NBC presents Worldwide 60, an adventure in television journalism. Tonight, Convention Preview, a study of the issues and men dominating the Democratic National Convention. Brought to you by Kentucky Kings, the only cigarette with a filter made of tobacco. An all-tobacco filter for that all-tobacco taste. Brought to you by Lipton Tea, the brisk tea in the flow-through tea bag. Your pitcher of pleasure, icy Lipton tea. By World Book Encyclopedia and Childcraft, and the 50,000 men and women who represent this important educational work throughout the world. Now, the NBC hosts for the convention coverage, the award-winning news team of Chet Huntley and David Brinkley.
The major contenders for the Democratic nomination are all here. Kennedy, Symington, Stevenson, Johnson, so are the dark horses, but there's little talk of dark horses here tonight. Rather, the speculation centers on what ballot Kennedy is going to walk off with the prize.
For a report, we go to NBC headquarters at the Biltmore Hotel and Frank Bergholzer.
This, the headquarters hotel, is the land of the smoke-filled room. Therefore, NBC News has installed this television studio, a light-filled room, we might call it. and a whole suite of network operations offices. Also here, a 24-hour operating newsroom has been created as the focal point of this NBC wing. Here we have not only the major independent news services, but also the special NBC convention wire, carrying by teletype to all NBC transmission points our own fast-breaking stories. This news coverage is directed from the news desk. The emphasis is news anywhere in this hotel, or in other hotels, or wherever the news develops downtown. From this headquarters, an unbelievable network of wires and cables has entangled the entire Biltmore Hotel to make feasible remote pickups from virtually anywhere, including the living quarters of the various candidates, as we shall see shortly. Frank Bergholzer reporting from NBC headquarters in the Biltmore Hotel.
NBC will continue with this special preview report on the Democratic National Convention after this message from Kentucky Kings.
Tobacco experts tried them first. It's a great new cigarette. Has a filter made of tobacco itself. All tobacco filter. All tobacco taste. Perfect. It's new Kentucky Kings with the all tobacco filter for that all tobacco taste. All tobacco filter. All tobacco taste. Only new Kentucky Kings. A luxury blend combined with the all tobacco filter made from natural golden tobacco cut filter fine. Yes, filter fine, creating a new kind of cigarette. Kentucky Kings. All tobacco filter. All tobacco taste. It's the best news smokers ever had.
What a filter. Never dulls the taste as artificial filters do.
Tastes far better than my old brand, and it had no filter. What a smoke. Get new Kentucky Kings. All tobacco filter for that all tobacco taste.
This special Worldwide 60 report on the pre-convention activities in Los Angeles will continue after this pause for station identification.
Huntley Brinkley for the most comprehensive Democratic Convention coverage starting Monday.
This is Los Angeles. We could stop right there, but there's more. For example, the city's mayor, Norris Polson, here seen in one of his lighter moments, playing honorary sheriff. It's the city where a Democratic delegate on leaving his airplane is greeted by girls in white dresses, strolling musicians, a basket of local goodies, and agents of 4 candidates asking for his vote. It's almost enough to turn a man's head. A city where they hire searchlights to open supermarkets, wear shorts downtown, where the undertakers own their own cemeteries, and where they raise political money so fast for the first time in history a convention was paid for before it began. The speed limit on these freeways is 65, but at rush hour you average maybe 6. Some convention sessions may open with the delegates still out there, stalled, listening to their automobile radios. The crowds for anything are enormous, as for example, the Dodgers, who may be remembered in Brooklyn. They drew 150,000 people to 3 games. It's a city where the most serious problem is a shortage of water, but nevertheless has more swimming pools than anywhere else. Because of the smog, trash burning is illegal, but backyard barbecuing is not. The biggest industry is the aircraft factories, but at the moment several are slowed down by strikes, and even where they are working, there is always the fear of a decision in the Pentagon that means the end of a government contract on which so many jobs depend. There are drawbacks, such as the difficulty of getting around, but it seems to be a good place for those who like to wear paper hats, blow horns, decorate themselves with badges, and parade the sidewalks behind a Latin jazz band. In Los Angeles, nobody minds. Across from the headquarters hotel is Pershing Square. Here, passing exhibitionists, spiritualists, crackpots, reformers, cultists, and other interesting people talk, sing, and make noise. Generally, everybody ignores it.
You them cameras on me, I can tell you, because we cannot pass it. So the next word is this. I love it. So listen, ain't only you worry with them cameras. Everything you got in there.
Then, of course, there is the nightlife, which is lively, much more so than most. The Democrats came west for several reasons. Los Angeles promised the money and delivered. The West is growing in population and Democratic voting power. The weather is good. It hasn't rained on these dates in about 90 years. There are plenty of nut burgers, celebrities, chiropractors, a fine convention hall, good food, more than enough candidates. Anything you want to buy, whatever it is, you can buy it all night. And it may be as useful for the Democrats to see the West as for the West to see the Democrats.
NBC continues now with its Worldwide 60 preview report on the Democratic National Convention.
Fun stuff, huh? Great stuff. Nobody could write quite like David Brinkley. I bet you love looking at all that cool 50s architecture and the great cars. I'm sure Rick was paying attention to the cars. Yeah. So when you were a kid, did you guys have color TV, black and white TV?
Black and white. We didn't get a color TV until, oh boy, I don't know. I'd be like 12 or something, right? I remember we got one. I remember it. It was like a gigantic console thing that, it was like gigantic, and it, it took up. It was a piece of furniture, man. In fact,
it was.
In fact, do you know why the first TV station I worked at in Kitchener, Ontario, was owned by Electro Home, but it was part of it was actually started as a furniture company. Dealcraft, I think is what the name of the company was. Mm-hmm. And because they were making furniture, they ended up making televisions.
That's very true. And that goes back to the early days of radio. When you had radio consoles, usually the owner of your local radio station was also the owner of your local furniture store, and the station was sponsored by the furniture store because the radio was considered a piece of furniture. Same with your record player, your Victrola, big old floor model.
Yes, I remember taking that old color television to the garbage dump. We had it for years and years and years and years and years.
You shouldn't have thrown it away.
Those
sell for big bucks now, refurbished on eBay.
I remember we went to the place and it was loaded into a trailer, and my dad pushed that thing. It went into like a hopper thing that it would chew everything up. Right? It wasn't like dumped into the landfill immediately. It had to go into this machine, and he pushed it over, and that old console TV went down in there and smash. It was like, holy crap. And
I bet that was cool, though.
Yeah, the tube broke and everything, and it was kind of sad.
That kind of makes me sad.
And do you know who you need? Everybody needs Pete Peterson. Pete Peterson, TV repairman. Pete Peterson used to come right to our house to fix that old color TV.
Oh.
And I remember one time he couldn't fix it at the house. Old tube TV, tubes, right? Inside, like vacuum tubes. He had to take it back to his shop. And it was a big job to get that thing. And he had an old station wagon, an old Plymouth station wagon. He had to load that big old console TV into the back of that thing. Yeah, but he was a great old guy. Pete Peterson to the rescue. Every time that the color would go wonky on the TV, you had to call up Pete Peterson. Get Pete Peterson. And my parents were like, Did you call Pete Peterson?
Well, I had my very own Pete Peterson in my house. My dad and my mom. True story. When I was a kid, they had a side business that they ran out of our garage, and they bought those old cool TV and radio console things and had a garage full of them, and they'd buy them cheap. People were unloading them, so they'd fix them up, which back then was easy. You could fix them with some new tubes usually and a good degaussing, and boom, it's as good as new. They lasted forever. So my folks had a whole garage full. They were out there tinkering and fixing the damn things all day, and then they'd resell them for a big markup. And had we hung on to some of those, darn it, I'd be a millionaire today because those are worth a lot of money.
Curtis Mathis.
Curtis Mathis.
Do you remember those Curtis Mathis
I sure
TVs?
do.
Do you know why they went out of business?
I don't know.
because their TVs are too darn good. They lasted too long.
They were great TVs.
Yeah.
Those and the Zeniths were the best.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the Zeniths were the ones that we never had to do much work on. They just kept running like a top forever and ever. And this was in the 70s, mind you, like early to mid 70s that my folks had this business. I was just a little kid. So I literally grew up, Rick, in a room full of TV screens and radios. So is it any wonder that I wanted to go into broadcasting? I was literally surrounded by the darn things, and a lot of them were from the 1950s, 1960s, some of those earliest models, and the stuff that people watched the Huntley Brinkley report on January 1st, 1959, and this was the news of January 6th, 1959.
This is Chet Huntley's second and last night off. I'm David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
And this is NBC News, the Huntley Brinkley Report, assembled for television every weekday night by the world's largest and most comprehensive broadcast news organization, the News Department of the National Broadcasting Company.
Cuba took a few more steps toward a return to normal today. The Batista rubber stamp Congress was dissolved, and genuine free elections were promised within 2 years. Another sign of returning government as usual, political leaders like Castro and Provisional President Urrutia are giving interviews. A direct NBC News report from Herb Kaplow in Havana.
This is Herb Kaplow, NBC News, in the studios of CMQ-TV in Havana. Cuba's national hero, Fidel Castro, tired but triumphant, continued his victory march across Cuba today. He's about 200 miles away from Havana. Today, Castro stopped long enough for a few words with an NBC News team in Santa Clara.
You have a tremendous following, Mr. Castro, in the United States, especially now that you have won. How does it feel to win? Really, I feel full of duty and obligation. I only feel that I have to work very much for the people and to work without resting for the people, to do for them what they want. What can the people of the United States do to better relations between Cuba and the United States? Well, it is a matter of wish in first place. That's right. And to improve our relation in all the economical orders, and I wish to have the best consideration as friend of the United States in economic matter.
The victorious revolution symbolized by Castro has made Cuba the most recent of several Latin American nations to veer away from dictatorship. Along with Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela, Cuba now faces the sterner challenge of peace, namely embedding democracy permanently into its foundation, throwing off the shackles of its relatively recent Spanish colonialism, and ending the cycles of democracy to dictatorship and back to democracy permanently on the democracy mark. The new Cuban president, Manuel Urrutia, touched on a specific of this when asked what is Cuba's big problem now.
The economy that is not too bad, but that Batista disturbed very much.
Do you have anything special in mind to do along these lines?
Yes, to restore order that is restored almost all of it, and to be a honest government, in Cuba. All the people want to have honest governments.
What is the status of your sugar crop? This is the harvesting season, and sugar is your big source of income.
I think the next sugar crop will be very good economically.
What about gambling in Cuba?
no gambling at all.
Many of Havana's plush hotels have depended on gambling. Now the warning of the new regime has the hotel managers and gamblers worried enough not to make a move until the situation becomes clearer. The Castro Group and many non-affiliated Cubans believe gambling hurts rather than helps the economy, but it's hurt morale through the widely held belief that gambling's made American racketeers richer at the expense of Cubans, and the memory that ousted dictator Batista fattened his personal fortunes on the gambling casino. Herb Kaplow, NBC News, Havana.
Fascinating. You know what's really, really fascinating about that, Rick, is that the way the news, the American news, was portraying Castro, as well as the American government. He was our friend. He was the good guy. He was the great liberator who overthrew the dictatorship of Batista. And he was our buddy, and he was good until he wasn't. And boy, did our coverage change. What I'm going to show you next, we're going to fast forward just 3 short years when Castro went from being the good guy to the devil himself. And this is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is October 23rd, 1962. The previous night, President Kennedy had made that televised address, you know, telling people what was going on with the missiles down in Cuba. And everybody was on the edge of their seats, scared to death that nuclear war was about to break out. And it was up to Chet Huntley and David Brinkley to bring some calmness to the situation and give you just the facts, nothing more. No editorializing, just the facts.
In Cuba, the militia has been mobilized. Havana radio has been exhorting the people all day with cries of fatherland or death, we will conquer. Tonight, Premier Castro is addressing his people. Richard Valeriani of NBC News reports from WCKT Miami.
Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro has been speaking for about an hour to the Cuban people on a nationwide radio and television hookup. This is his first public reaction to the American arms blockade, and Castro is bitterly angry. He called the blockade the most dangerous adventure since the end of World War II. He said the United States undertook the blockade because all its other efforts to destroy the Cuban Revolution have failed. The speech is full of his usual blast at American imperialism. Castro says Cuba has no intention of letting the United States know what weapons it has. He says that Cuba is a sovereign nation not because of the United States, but because Cuba won its own sovereignty. To take it away, he said, the United States will have to sweep us off the face of the earth. While Fidel Castro was sounding off in Havana, President Kennedy's strong words of last night are still being translated into positive action all along the eastern seaboard. This train, loaded with troops and trucks and half-tracks, is moving through Florida tonight. Its destination is unknown. At the United Nations, representatives of the United States, Russia, and Cuba stated their positions. They seemed irreconcilable. If there was any room for maneuver, it was hard to locate. Here is NBC's United Nations correspondent, Pauline Frederick.
The Security Council is in troubled recess tonight on the Cuban crisis. The lines between the United States and the Soviet Union firmly drawn. Each accuses the other of threatening the world with destruction of the UN and nuclear war. American Delegate Stevenson introduced a resolution demanding that Russian offensive weapons and bases be dismantled and withdrawn from Cuba, with a team of UN observers verifying compliance. The resolution also calls for a prompt meeting between the United States and Russia on war and peace issues, presumably between President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev. Soviet Delegate Zorin and Cuban Delegate Garcia Inchostegui both rejected the Stevenson proposal. Zorin introduced a resolution demanding that the Council condemn American aggression and ordered the United States to negotiate with Cuba. Stevenson will undoubtedly oppose this plan tomorrow. The non-aligned nations are trying to draft a compromise, not so much for the Council, but for a special emergency session of the General Assembly when Zorin casts a veto on the American resolution. Here are some of the highlights of today's Security Council meeting.
Mr. President, I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons. It further authorizes and requests the Acting Secretary General to dispatch to Cuba a United Nations Observer Corps to assure and report on compliance with this resolution. Upon UN certification of compliance, it calls for the termination of the measures of quarantine against military shipments to Cuba. And in conclusion, it urgently recommends that the United States and the Soviet Union confer promptly on measures to remove the existing threat to the security of the Western Hemisphere and the peace of the world, and to report thereon to the Security Council. The issue which confronts the Security Council is grave. Were it not, I should not have detained you so long. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been no threat to the vision of peace so profound, no challenge to the world of the Charter so fateful. The hopes of mankind are concentrated in this room. The action we take may determine the future of civilization. I know that this Council will approach the issue with a full sense of our responsibility and a solemn understanding of the import of our deliberations. There is a road to peace. The beginning of that road is marked out in the resolution I have submitted for your consideration. If we act promptly, we will have another chance to take up again the dreadful questions of nuclear arms and military bases, and the means and causes of aggression and of war, to take them up and do something about them. This is a solemn, I believe, and significant day for the life of the United Nations and the hope of the world community. Let it be remembered not as the day when the world came to the edge of nuclear war, but as the day when men resolved to let nothing thereafter stop them in their quest for peace. Thank you, sir.
Now, according to the statement that was made by the delegate of the United States, there are two types of military bases. There are two types of rockets. The good military bases and the bad ones. The good rockets and the bad rockets. And obviously, the government of the United States reserves the right to decide and determine when a rocket is good and when a rocket is bad or naughty, when a base is good and when a base is naughty.
Mr. Stevenson touched upon the question also of bases in various parts of the world. He has, however, failed to mention that the United States have these bases in 35 countries of the world, appropriating to themselves the role of the world policeman. But what is surprising is that Mr. Stevenson has practically said nothing about the grounds, the political and legal and moral grounds based in the Charter of the United Nations for those aggressive acts that were undertaken by the government of the United States over the past 24 hours against the small Cuban state.
For a view of developments as seen from the White House, here is NBC correspondent Ray Sheeran.
This is what you might call a reasonably accurate facsimile of an historic document. Its title is Interdiction of the Delivery of Offensive Weapons to Cuba. This is the paper which clamps the blockade on delivery of arms to Cuba, effective at 10 o'clock in the morning. President signed it at 7:06 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time tonight. The usually illegible Kennedy scrawl was firm and plain this time, as if the President wanted to be sure that even Nikita Khrushchev could recognize his signature. Mr. Kennedy was solemn and unsmiling as he wrote John Fitzgerald Kennedy to this document, which is intended to move Soviet missiles out of this hemisphere. Within minutes after he signed, the proclamation was going forth to all world capitals, to all foreign ministries.
I wanted to show you how they covered the United Nations meetings that were so critical during the missile crisis. Even though ultimately the crisis was resolved through non-diplomatic channels, it was resolved through back channels with Khrushchev and Kennedy and Robert Kennedy negotiating behind the scenes. Still, that was the public face that the whole world was watching, was the United Nations, right? Because we created the United Nations after World War II to prevent another world war. There we were on the brink of it. And notice the way that NBC News covered it. You heard all three sides of the story, uncensored. You heard what the Cuban ambassador said. You heard what the USSR ambassador said, and what Adlai Stevenson said. Today, how do they cover the United Nations in this current day and age? You never get to hear what our friend Dmitry Polyansky says when he's at the United Nations speaking on behalf of Russia.
That's right.
They cut him.
Yep.
They don't let him speak. They don't even give him 30 seconds.
Yep. Yep. Very unbalanced.
That's right.
Times have changed. Journalism's dead, as we knew it, pretty much.
Yeah, it is. I mean, all you have to do is take a look at the past. And that's why I brought these selected clips tonight of some very historic events in the history of the world, the late 20th century, the television age. I wanted us to remember how it's done and how it's done right. And sometimes even we forget that what our job is, and it's just to tell people what happened. There's a wonderful quote from David Brinkley that I've always used throughout my whole career as a journalist, and I still use it every single day. It's my barometer. He reminds us all that it's not our job as journalists to love or to hate. Our job is just to tell you what happened as best as we can ascertain. You know, sometimes we can't ascertain things until years after the fact when all of the information becomes available.
I don't know if it's even possible to do that anymore.
Yeah. Right, because there's so much bullshit out there.
And because of the nature of the medium that we're working in,
right?
Because actually it's because of the censorship. Inadvertently, it prevents us from even providing balanced coverage. They sort of, even because of the censorship, they force you to sort of take a position. For instance, I've had strikes imposed against me on YouTube simply because I provided balanced coverage.
That's right.
And because I presented a side of the story that YouTube didn't agree with, but still presented their side of the story, not that it was their story, but the side that they agreed with. I presented both, so that wasn't allowed. So
they
just by
you.
Yep, that's right. So I get penalized for that.
That's right. For doing journalism.
Yeah, I was accused of hate speech.
Hate speech.
Yeah. I was like,
or worse. Worse. They accuse you of misinformation when you're giving true and accurate information. You're literally doing your job correctly, and you get penalized for that. And then it makes you self-censor because you don't want to lose your channel. You don't want another strike. And I think that deprives the viewers out there, the news consumers, if you will, of the best coverage possible, the best journalism possible.
And so you end up sort of like, if you want to survive in this environment online, you almost have to sort of become an activist. You have to promote something. The successful channels all do that.
Yep.
You pick a side, you go with that team, you build a community around you, cheerleading for your side, and that's how you make a successful channel. If you try to be like me, you make 11 cents.
That's right.
Because you're not, I'm not sitting there either pro Trudeau or pro overthrow the government or pro this or, you know. So people are like, well, what team are you on? And people will support a cause, if you will, right?
Yes.
But they're not as inclined to support neutrality.
Exactly.
Which is really what we need. You need some unbiased reporting to help get you closer to the truth.
That's right.
If all you have is bias, you're not at the truth. You've got a slanted perspective on something, and at that point, somebody's trying to sell you something. There's a big difference.
Well, you know, when you and I were coming up and when we went to journalism school and we learned our craft, we were taught to never, ever, ever do that.
Yes.
Never pick a side. Never editorialize. That was the kiss of death in journalism. You could not show favor or hatred towards one side or the other. That was your job. You'd be out of work. Your name is mud in the industry.
You get your ass fired.
Yep. Oh,
and to this day, like I cringe. I find it's uncomfortable for me to work in this environment because I do offer my opinion. And I was trained not to do that, but here I sit doing it to some degree every night. But I'm still, I think, more balanced than the vast majority of the others out there who are doing podcasts or live streams.
That's right. And in a way, it's very freeing, isn't it? There's a great feeling of freedom after all the years we spent in mainstream media where we weren't allowed to ever express our opinions about things. Now, because of internet podcasting, we can. We're free to do that. And in a way, it's really cool as a journalist to be able to do that when you have a strong opinion on something and you want to express it. At least you won't get fired for saying that. But back then and throughout pretty much all of journalism history, it was forbidden. It was exceedingly, exceedingly rare. And I'm going to show you just how rare it was. This is one time that a major newscaster was allowed to show emotion, an opinion on the air. And, you know, on the day that President Kennedy was killed, on November 22nd, 1963, everybody thinks of Walter Cronkite, right? That rare moment. And it's only a few seconds when, you know, Walter announces that President Kennedy died and he takes off his glasses for a moment and he kind of wipes a little tear. His voice cracks for just a moment, right? That was shocking. Walter Cronkite showed emotion, right?
That's right. Yeah.
But it's interesting. Most people don't remember what NBC and Huntley and Brinkley did that night. Everyone thinks of Cronkite. So I wanted to show you this because here's Huntley and Brinkley on the same network working as a team. And yet these two men took very different angles, different approaches to how they talked about the murder of JFK. And I'll show you what Huntley said first, and then I'll show you what Brinkley said.
It's been said that television news came of age with its coverage of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963.
Remember Jane Pauley?
It was television that helped hold the country together during that terrible time. On the evening of November 22nd, 1963, Chef Huntley reported the facts and held up sort of a mirror to America.
It's a logical assumption that hatred, far left, far right, political, religious, economic, or paranoid, moved the person or persons who today committed this combined act of murder and national sabotage. There is in this country, and there has been for too long, an ominous and sickening popularity of hatred. The body of the president lying at this moment in Washington is the thundering testimonial of what hatred comes to and the revolting excesses it perpetrates. Hatred is self-generating, contagious. It feeds upon itself and explodes into violence. It is no inexplicable phenomenon that there are pockets of hatred in our country, areas and communities where the disease is permitted or encouraged or given status by those who can and do influence others. You and I have heard in recent months someone say, those Kennedys ought to be shot. A well-known man. In its own defense, it said it was only joking, but the left has been equally bad. Tonight, it might be the hope and the resolve of all of us that we've heard the last of this kind of talk, jocular or serious, for the result is tragically the same.
Very interesting what he said there, because we could give that same advice to people today. I hear you give that same advice to people on Maverick News practically every single day. But now you're free to say that. Back in 1963, it was unheard of. I mean, it had to be marked as commentary, first of all. You know, they had to put up a special graphic on the screen to tell the viewer, this is our opinion segment, right? This is commentary. This is not the news. This is a rare bit of commentary, and I do mean rare. So then you compare what Huntley just did to how Brinkley approached it. This is the same day, or rather same night. Remember, the JFK assassination changed how television news was done. We had never done continuous coverage before of anything. From the time that the news broke, around 1 o'clock Eastern time, then all the networks went into continuous coverage for the next 3 days. They were on the air practically 24/7. And what I'm going to show you now is a clip of David Brinkley from November 22nd, 1963. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning, after the events of a long, dizzying day, the American people are struggling to make sense of what just happened. It's a nation in shock. And many of you watching were probably children. You may have a memory of that day, and you probably remember watching TV while your parents were sitting there crying and trying to make sense of it all, and you might have been watching this very broadcast. But the difference, Huntley took that moment to editorialize. Brinkley, on the other hand, just tells people what happened.
We're about to wind this up for tonight because about all that could happen on one day has. For some final reflection on one of the more horrible days in American history, you find there is a great deal that could be said about the political and other changes we can look forward to now, but I think it would be bad taste to go into that now, and I won't. It has all been shocking, but perhaps one element in the shock was the speed. By the Washington clock, at a little after 1 o'clock this afternoon, President Kennedy was about as alive as any human being ever gets. Young, strong, vigorous, looking forward to, no doubt, 5 more years, he hoped, of leadership in this country and of the Western world. His wife, young, beautiful, looking very happy, was beside him and seeming to be having a wonderful time and leaning across the back seat of the car to say to him, "You can't say Dallas hasn't been friendly to you." And that was a little after 1 o'clock. 5 hours later, at 6 o'clock, Mr. Kennedy had been murdered. Lyndon Johnson was President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy was a widow, a brave and composed one that nobody could fail to admire. All of them were back in Washington, returning in the same airplane that took them to Texas to an incredible tragedy. And the sheer speed of it was just too fast for the senses. Roosevelt, dead of a stroke, came back here from Warm Springs, Georgia, in a train, the sides of it draped in black crepe. It steamed majestically across the southern landscape toward Washington, taking a little time about it and giving everybody a time to think a bit about what had happened.
but not today. There is seldom any time to think anymore, and today there was none. In about 4 hours, we had gone from President Kennedy in Dallas alive to back in Washington dead, and a new president in his place. There is no more news here tonight, and really no more to say, except that what has happened today has been just too much, too ugly, and too fast. Frank?
Thank you, Dave. The Dallas police chief, Jesse Curry, announced just a few moments ago that charges of murdering President Kennedy have been filed against Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine with a history of connection with left-wing causes.
Ooh, left-wing causes. See, already they were telling you he was a communist. Yeah, they wanted you to think that Castro did it. They wanted you to think he was an agent of Soviet Russia. Even though there was, as it turned out many years later, we found out that that was not exactly true. Here we are 60 years later, about to come up on the 60th anniversary this November, and we still don't know the whole story about Lee Harvey Oswald because the United States government, and specifically the CIA, is withholding to this day very important files that will tell us a lot about Lee Harvey Oswald and his work for the CIA. But on November 22nd, 1963, they weren't lying to you. That's just all they really honestly knew. It wasn't some big conspiracy for David Brinkley and Chet Huntley to sit there and lie to you. That was just the only information they had available to them from the usual sources. The Dallas Police Department, the FBI, the White House. That's where they would turn for information, and they told you what happened. And David Brinkley right there was just telling the American people what happened.
That's
very
right.
poetically and quite eloquently. So, yeah, so what do you think?
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's wrap up this tribute to David Brinkley with, you got to have this. Their last broadcast, the very last Huntley Brinkley report, was on July 31st, 1970. And even though, all throughout the 60s, they were competing against Walter Cronkite, right? The CBS Evening News. But in real life, they were actually quite good friends. And on the night of the final Huntley Brinkley news half hour, Walter Cronkite over there on the CBS Evening News said his own goodbye to them, his friends.
Since he came out of the West to team with David Brinkley back in 1956, Chet Huntley has been our competitor, and what a competitor. But he also is a colleague and a good friend. Tonight, over on that other network, as we say, he's saying goodnight to David for the last time on their evening newscast, returning to his native Montana to build a resort, and I suspect perhaps to get involved in politics. As he leaves the daily broadcast scene, a giant departs the stage. For journalism and for ourselves, we hate to see him go. But that's the way it is. Friday, July 31st, 1970. Goodbye, Chet.
Bye, and good luck, Walter.
Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color, this has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
And so, this difficult moment is here. In leaving this post after almost 14 years, I recommend to you the NBC Nightly News, which begins tomorrow. It'll be in the most capable hands of David, John Chancellor, and Frank McGee. I'll be watching with interest and affection. I might also remind you that American journalism, all of it, is the best anywhere in the world. I want to thank the entire staff of NBC, for this nightly broadcast has not been an individual effort by any means. And as for you out there, I thank you first for your patience, then for your many kindnesses and the flattering things you have said and written. More difficult to take, to be sure, has been your criticism, but that too has been helpful and in most cases valid. But you have bolstered my conviction that this land contains an incredible quality and quantity of good common sense, and it's in no danger of being led down the primrose path by a journalist. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would say to all of you, be patient and have courage, for there will be better and happier news one day if we work at it. And David, thanks for these years of happy association and for being such an easy colleague to work with and for all the kindnesses.
Chet, I too would like to thank all of those who tune us in and put up with us, particularly including those who write the nasty letters. McGee and Chancellor and I will be here every night, and we'll miss you. Last night, NBC had a dinner for Chet and gave all of us a chance to say goodbye to him, and as a farewell gift, NBC gave him a horse. So, Chet, when you ride away to the west, to Montana, on your new horse, I will have to admit to at least a mild envy. And when you're out there under clear skies and clean air, maybe once in a while you will think of those of us still here, fighting the traffic, the transportation breakdowns, strikes, pollution, and wondering what is left that we can eat, drink, smoke, or breathe that will not kill us, and wondering what horror will be visited upon us next. In these years, I have often been stopped in public by people, polite, who knew I was either Huntley or Brinkley, but weren't sure which, and so they would ask. Well, from now on, when somebody stops me in the street and says, "Aren't you Chet Huntley?" I have an answer. It is no, ma'am. He is the one out west on the horse. I really don't want to say it, but the time has come, and so, for the last time, good luck and good night, Chet.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC News.
Kind of gets you right in the feels, doesn't it? It does me. I got one last David Brinkley story, though, that we got to talk about. And this was years and years and years later. And I bet you remember this, Rick. In 1996, election night, 1996, that would be his last time doing election coverage. He was at ABC then. And he delivered some pretty sharp parting shots at President Clinton. I don't know if you remember this. You know, Clinton had just won re-election. And it was the end of the night. You know how they used to kind of gather the whole crew around, Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts, and Peter Jennings, and they'd all sit in a semicircle and discuss the events of the night, you know, as they're closing out. And it's one of my favorite David Brinkley moments, because it was one of those rare moments where he editorialized. I guess he figured, hey, I'm about to retire. I don't give a damn. I'm David Brinkley. I'm going to speak my mind. And he did. He told the viewers that night that with President Clinton's re-election, that they could expect more goddamn nonsense for the next 4 years. He did. Now, he said Clinton was a bore, said he didn't have a creative bone in his body, and he was just awful. Now, of course, there was a flood of complaints about this, and David got in all kinds of trouble. But he claimed his mea culpa was, I didn't know we were on the air. I thought that supposedly it was, I guess it was like a hot mic moment for Brinkley. He did not know that he was on the air, apparently, speaking his mind. But it turned into this whole kerfuffle, right? And then the president got involved, Bill Clinton. And Brinkley actually apologized to the president for what he'd said. But He later said in an interview after he retired, when he could be more honest, and he said in his book that he actually meant every goddamn word. And he really wasn't sorry. Sorry, not sorry. And then he brilliantly parlayed the whole kerfuffle into an interview with the president. That's how he got Clinton to sit down and talk to him for an hour. Isn't that great?
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.